Part 2. Settling New England. North of Chesapeake Bay was different from Virginian English settlement. New England colonists were made up of the middle-class families that could pay their own ways across Atlantic. In the Northeast, there were a few indentured servants and no planter elite. Most of the male settlers were small farmers, merchants, yeomen, or fishermen. The New England attracted more women than the southern colonies, and although the soil was not as fertile as that of the South, it was much more healthier to settle in the North. Unlike the early Jamestown colonists arriving at the American society to seek adventure or profit, most early New Englanders were devout Puritans that embraced a rigorous Protestant faith than others. The Puritans had a divine mission to create a model Christian society, living in accordance to purify the Catholic and Anglican rituals, to enact a code of settlement, and to provide a beacon of righteousness, wanted to enact a code of laws and a government structure of biblical principles. In 1620, a band of Puritan refugees heading to Virginia strayed off the course and made a landfall at Cape Cod, off the southern coast of what became Massachusetts. These pilgrims became more radical sect of the Puritans and the Separatists. The Church of England, according to the Puritans, retained too many vestiges of the Catholicism. Viewing themselves as the godly, they demanded the Anglican Church to rid themselves of the papist rituals. The Separatists went further, having decided the Church of England would not be fixed. They resolved to create the godly congregations, and such rebelliousness infuriated the leaders of Church of England. During the late 16th century, Separatists were hunted and persecuted as the English authorities. Massachusetts Bay. Plymouth colony's populations never rose above 7,000, and after 10 years, it was overshadowed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Most of the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were Congregationalists. The colony was intended to become a holy commonwealth, founded by the harmonious worship of God, and formed self-governing churches with membership limited to visible saints. But unlike the Separatists, Puritans hoped to reform the Church of England. A joint stock company called the Massachusetts Bay Company, and consists of a group of English Puritans led by John Winthrop, a lawyer animated by the religious convictions. Winthrop resolved to use the colony for the persecuted Puritans, and Winthrop's group took their charter and the government authority to Massachusetts Bay, hoping to ensure local control. Massachusetts Bay was self-governing. In 1630, Arbella with John Winthrop arrived at Massachusetts with 700 Puritans on board, and 200 of the exiles died in the crossing. A model of Christian charity is a lay sermon delivered on board, and Winthrop told their fellow Puritans that they were a group of chosen people. The transfer of Massachusetts charter, whereby an English trading company evolved to a provincial government, which was unique to venture in colonization. Under the royal charter, this power rested with the Massachusetts General Court, electing the governor and the deputy governor. The General Court had two houses, the House of Assistants and the House of Deputies, corresponding to the House of Commons, and although the charter remained unchanged, government was quite different from the original expectation. Rhode Island became a staging area for the New England colonies. Out of their religious quarrels prompted some to leave their original colony, and Roger Williams, arriving in England in 1631, was one of the first to cause problems because of a devout Puritan. He criticized Massachusetts, clashing with John Winthrop's cherishing of authority. Williams championed liberty and authority, promoting mercy. Williams was also one of the small number of Puritans that believed that the complete separation of the church and state, where the freedom of all coercions in the matter of faith was important. In 1636, the town of Providence, at the head of Narragansett Bay, the first permanent settlers in Rhode Island, was established, and Rhode Island became home to all that were persecuted in Massachusetts Bay, including Baptists, Quakers, Jews, and Boston officials came to view Rhode Island as a refuge for rogues. The colony of Rhode Island and the Providence plantations, the smallest in America, began in Narragansett Bay as a refuge for dissenters, agreeing that the state had no right to coerce religious belief. Anne Hutchinson, she quarreled with the Puritan leaders, and she had been raising 13 children, serving as the healer in a midlife. hosting meetings in her Boston home to discuss sermons. However, the sermons became the forums of Anne's commentaries on religious subject matter, and she claimed that she had experienced direct revelations from the Holy Spirit, which her neighbor has saved, and which were not saved, including the ministers. New England expands. The Connecticut had conventional beginning in 1633. A group of Plymouth settled in the Connecticut River Valley, and 3 years later, Thomas Hooker led the three church Congregationists from Massachusetts Bay to the Connecticut River towns of Wethersfield, Windsor, and Hartford. In 1637, the inhabitants organized a self-governing colony of Connecticut, and 2 years later, the Connecticut General adopted the Fundamental Orders, a series of laws that provided a Christian commonwealth, except voting was not limited to the church members. The governor was commanded to rule according to the word of God. Indians in New England. The English settlers who poured into the New England found a region populated by 100,000 Indians who coped with the newcomers in different ways, and many resistors and others sought accommodation, but some actually grew dependent on the Europeans. It also alternately enriched and devastated the lives of Indians to facilitate the acquisition of the fur pelts from the Indians, and the French and the Dutch built permanent trading outposts along their western frontier and established amicable relations with the indigenous people. They sought to exploit the Indians rather than deal with them on an equal footing. In Maine, the Abenakis primarily hunted or gathered upon the natural offerings of the land and waters. Algonquin tribes of the southern New England, Massachusetts, Nausetts, Narragansetts, Pequots, and Wampanoags were more horticultural, and the coastal Indians helped the white settlers develop a subsistence economy and developed a flourishing trade with the newcomers, exchanging the furs of the manufactured goods as trinkets. The various Indian tribes in New England often fought along themselves. They were not fragmented, but also vulnerable to the infectious diseases that carried on the board with the ships transporting the British settlers to the New World, and smallpox epidemic devastated the Indian people, and the Indians fell sick of the smallpox and died most miserably. The Pequot War. Indians that survived the epidemics refused to yield their lands and were forced out. In 1636, settlers in the Massachusetts accused of a Pequot murdering colonist, taking revenge by setting fire to a Pequot village in the Mystic River. As the Indians fled their burning huts, the Puritans killed them. And then during the Pequot War of 1637, colonists and their Narragansett allies killed hundreds of Pequots in the village near West Mystic in the Connecticut River Valley. King Philip's War. After the Pequot War, the prosperous fur trade contributed to the peaceful relations between Europeans and the remaining Indians, but the relentless growth of white population and the decline of the beaver population began to reduce the eastern tribes' relative poverty. The era of the peaceful coexistence that had begun with the Treaty of Hartford in 1638 came with a bloody end during the last quarter of the 17th century. Metacomet, or King Philip, resented English efforts to convert Indians into Christianity, and there was devastation on both sides. Colonies had to institute America's first conscription laws, drafting them into militias. Were all males between the ages of 16 and 60, and the colonists ended up winning, and King Philip was beheaded. The Carolinas. Proprietary colonies granted by King Charles II. They recruited British planters from the Caribbean islands to replicate in South Carolina the profitable West Indian sugar plantation system based on the labor of the enslaved Africans. And government founded by the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, drawn by one of the 8 proprietors, encouraging a practice of large land grants, smaller head rights, and a grant of religious toleration designed to encourage immigration, giving South Carolina a greater degree of religious freedom. And South Carolina became a separate royal colony in 1719. North Carolina remained under the proprietor's rule for more than 10 years before transitioning authority to British Crown. Enslaving Indians. With the 8 English proprietors of South Carolina wanted the colony to focus on producing commercial crops. Such productions took time to develop, but these activities required labor, and South Carolinians brought enslaved Africans, yet slaves were expensive. They developed prosperous traders with the Indians to minimize the cost of labor, and growing contact and trade with the English made the Indians more vulnerable to the diseases, and commercial activity also made the Indians grow independent. And Indian captives from opposing tribes were often sold for slaves, and this became profitable. The colonists began using this to arouse conflicts between times. The middle colonies and Georgia, Netherlands becomes New York. During the early 17th century, the tiny, densely populated nation of Netherlands emerged as a maritime and a financial giant. By 1670, most of the Protestant Dutch had the largest merchant fleet in the world and the highest standard of living. They controlled the Northern Europe commerce and became one of our most diverse societies in Europe. And in England, King Charles II wanted to get rid of the New Netherlands, the Dutch colony. Like the French, the Dutch focused on fur trade, and the European demands for beaver hats created huge profits. The middle colonies, Georgia and Netherlands, become New York. The New Amsterdam was one of the most ethnically diverse colonial cities. Residents, including the Swedes, Norwegians, the Spaniards, Sephardic Jews, free blacks, English, Germans, Finns, as well as the Dutch. The ethnically diverse colonists prized their liberty and lived a smoldering state of near mutiny against the colony's governors. And the English plan to conquer the New Americans, or New Netherlands, was hatched by the Duke of York, and the English transformed the New Amsterdam into New York City. Judaism in North America. In September 8, 1654, 10 years before the English control of the Dutch colony of New Netherlands, French ships carrying 23 Jews were on board, and they began seeking refugees from Brazil. And they had fled earlier from Spain and Portugal, being exiled by Catholic Inquisition, and they were the first Jewish settlers to arrive in North America, and they were embraced. And it was all the way into the 19th century the Jewish community became something to experience this dramatic growth. In the Iroquois League, one of the most significant effects of the European settlements in North America during the 17th century was the intensification of the warfare among Indians. The same combination of forces decimating the indigenous populations of New England and the Carolinas affected the tribes around the Hudson River, NYC. In the interior of New York, however, the tribes of the Iroquois forged a very strong alliance as the Iroquois alliance grew big. When the Iroquois began to deplete their local game in the 1640s, they used firearms supplied by the Dutch trading partners to seize the Canadian hunting ground, and they were gaining a control over a huge area from St. Lawrence River to Tennessee and from Maine to Michigan. New Jersey was shortly after the conquest of New Netherlands, as the Duke of York granted lands between the Hudson and the Delaware River to Sir George Carteret, Lord John Berkeley. In 1676, the mutual agreement, New Jersey had become divided as a diagonal into East and West Jersey. East Jersey was populated 200 Dutch who had crossed the Hudson River, and new settlements gradually arose. The West had a scattered population of the Swedes, Finns, and the Dutch, too overwhelmed by the swarm of English and Welsh Quakers, as well as the Germans and the Scots Irish settlements. Pennsylvania and Delaware. The Quaker sect, or the Society of Friends, were called ridicule because they were one of the most influential of the many radical religions that had emerged throughout the turbulent English War, and Quakers were the subjects of intense persecution, and their tolerance included the complete religious freedom for everyone, gender equality. William Penn's Quaker Commonwealth rose in the colony of Pennsylvania. Penn was the son of Admiral Sir William Penn. As a student of the Oxford University, becoming a Quaker, and Penn quickly encouraged people of different religious affiliations, and Indians and Quakers had a cordial relationship due to the friendliness of Quakers and William's careful policies of purchasing land titles. Georgia. Georgia was the last colony established. Georgia was set up as a military buffer against Spanish Florida. James E. Oglethorpe was appointed to be the head of the province, and as a royal colony, Georgia acquired an effective agreement and a government for the first time as a royal colony developed slowly over the next decade, but grew rapidly in population and wealth with the West Indies.